Okay. Land Banking Illinois, Options for Rural Communities. So this workshop stems from the participation of a number of us on a conference last fall that was sponsored by the Center for Community Progress on Vacant and Abandoned Properties. And I happened to see Linda Lee Blaine from the Rural Institute at that conference. And I reached out to her and said, hey, a bunch of us are trying to work on trying to bring land banking to more of the rural communities in Illinois. And she introduced us to this conference, and here we are with this panel. So we had a panel just previous to this where we talked about land banking that Brent led that was really exceptional. And we're going to pick up that conversation here a little bit with some overviews from Brent Denzin, from Emily Doerr from the state of Michigan, and Mike Davis from the Central Illinois Land Bank. And our objective today was really, kind of twofold. One is to introduce, for those that are less familiar with land banking, just give you kind of a grounding in what land banks and land banking is. It's a concept that gets kicked around, but it doesn't always have a lot of definition. But the bigger idea here was to get some of the folks that are working at different levels of scale on a call or on a presentation to talk about what their experience has been in collaborating and working across geographies, where either they're working intentionally in rural communities or they're working with rural communities incidental to other work that they're doing and so forth. So I think I'm hopeful you'll have a good sense of the different opportunities for working at different levels of geographic scale and different types of issues. And so let's go ahead and get ourselves started. So I'm going to try to put up on screen some slides. If you guys can just let me know if you can see this. Yeah, I see Brent nodding. That's good. Okay. So again, I'm Brian White. I'm with eProperty Innovations. Our company is we help local governments. Most of our clients are land banks, but we help local governments leverage data and technology to really drive community revitalization. And we sort of have a community of practice of folks that work in land banking across the country, where we try to bring them together and strategize about what ways we can work with the tools we have available to try to drive comprehensive community revitalization. Our panelists today, we have Brent Denzin from Denzin Law, and I'm gonna let each of them introduce themselves. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time, but just as far as who they are, Brent Denzin, Mike Davis from the Central Illinois Land Bank, and Emily Doerr from Michigan State. Mike and Emily are both the executive directors of their respective organizations. So these are the leaders of the house, the top of the house are with us. For those that are not entirely familiar with land banks, and I know Brent touched on this in the last presentation, land banks have existed for a long time, and they're very well concentrated in a number of different states. So we're fortunate to have a pretty wide variety of practice in land banking, both metropolitan urban areas, semi-rural, suburban, and rural. I think there's a misperception that land banks are only for big cities. We hear a lot about Detroit or Cleveland or Chicago, but in fact, in lots of states, land banks are working in very rural areas, Georgia, Ohio, Michigan, New York State, and we're fortunate to work with a number of them. But this map is from the Center for Community Progress and just shows you the spread of land banks across the United States. And as you can see, it's generally concentrated in more of the post-industrial areas of the upper Midwest and the Southeast, but it is starting to move further west and further south as people start to recognize that land banking is actually a really useful tool for community development more generally. I borrowed Brent's slide, so you're going to see the same slide, but what I wanted to show here was on the right-hand side of the screen, we have where there are existing land banks. And on the left hand, I've highlighted a map that shows some of the rural counties that actually have land banks, either where they've considered forming a land bank or have actually formed a land bank and is actively operating. And I think Brent's going to be able to talk about a little bit of that experience. We have the Central Illinois Land Bank, which is not technically a rural area, but has obviously a very high concentration of rural population and communities. So Mike can speak to that experience. The other thing that we wanted to talk about, I mean, this was mentioned in this morning's presentations, but the notion that rural communities are somehow deficient or losing or dying, I thought it was really helpful to hear some of the presenters talk about how that's just not actually accurate. Whether it's for demographic reasons where the measurement of population masks what the trends are, or whether it's demographics where the population is aging and it's kind of creating a bulge in the population that's moving through a particular community. I think the sense that we have to really try to dispel is that Population loss is, for our purposes, an indicator of vacancy, but it is not an indicator necessarily of blight or of distress or of some kind of, less than. It's just a sign that communities are changing. And I think where land banks are helpful is they really help to address the transition of property and assets as they move through the natural life cycle of communities and community development. So the map on the left is showing rural communities that have experienced population loss in the decade between 2010 and 2019. And as you can see, there is some level of overlap, but not a lot. I think rural communities, there's a real opportunity to bring land banking as a tool for rural communities where there has been some level of population loss, or just some level of consolidation of population and industries and so forth, where now you have vacant structures that might be starting to pop up in your communities. The other thing, I mentioned this in one of our other presentations, but the other thing that's I think important to note is that rural communities in Illinois are served by different types of organizations. And so the expectation we have is that land banking is a partnering activity. It's a collaborative activity. It takes place across different types of organizations, both public sector and private sector. So the map on the right is showing you where you have community action agencies and service areas served by the Illinois Community Action Development Corporation, which is a housing developer serving rural areas primarily, or lots of rural areas. And so the idea here isn't to say that the IADC should be the go-to partner for land banks, but just simply to suggest that we look at communities as being comprised of different types of organizations, all of whom bring different types of things to the table. And one of the great things about land banks is that land banks can help stitch together those different types of interests into a cohesive whole. And I think that's illustrated that there are lots of organizations in our communities that we can work with. What we're going to be talking about today are just some, kind of high-level concepts. So the first one I want us to be thinking about is, where does a land bank, as we're talking about it, fill in certain capacity gaps? Every community has gaps, whether it's an urban community, metropolitan, regional community, suburban, et cetera. There's always gaps. And so land banks, I think, are great to think of in terms of gap fillers. And that's one of the reasons I was so excited to have Emily join us, is to talk about that notion of filling gaps and providing capacity on an as-needed basis. Second one is to think about your anchor institutions. We talked this morning in some of the presentations about asset-based community development, which is the idea of identifying who your community assets are and building from strength, as opposed to looking at your communities as being deficit-driven. So every one of our communities has anchor institutions, whether it's community colleges, health centers, big businesses, just civic leadership who's been around in the community for a long time. Understanding who those folks are and bringing them together in these sorts of collaborative relationships is a key part of community economic development. And our expectation is most of those folks are not involved in land banks or land banking because it's a relatively new concept. From our work, we think about keys to success, and I think a number of those are going to be, touched on in our presentations today. One is the idea of land banks form through intergovernmental and public-private partnerships. So this is an interesting model in Illinois, and Brent can speak about this in more detail, but it does bring together different types of resources with different types of skill sets and attributes. Second one is that land banks are really the key for successful land banking is to respond to local conditions and needs. And so we heard this morning about the importance of those of us that are coming from outside communities to listen and let local leadership lead. I think that's a really important reminder that we got today. And I just wanted to, kind of reinforce that those of us who have these sort of specialized skill sets, we don't have the expertise of those folks that are living in those communities or working in those communities. And so what we can do is we can be bringing resources to those communities and helping them leverage those resources they have and grow them into something more constructive. This third point about being reality-based is lots of the land banking work is based on acquiring and disposition of real estate. So it's very asset-based. It also has to be grounded in the reality that we live in a market-based economy where the cost of a length of lumber or a piece of pipe has a fixed cost. That cost can vary, but somebody has to pay those costs. And so a lot of the work that we're doing is trying to figure out how to distribute the cost of redevelopment across different types of cost centers and share the costs as well as the benefit. But our work has to be grounded in the reality that this stuff has a cost associated and nothing is free. Land banks are not free. They don't dispose of property for free. The last thing I wanted to mention is just that in our view, and this is something that we may have as a view that's distinct from other groups, but we see land banking as really a strategy for addressing the entire community holistically. It's a community development strategy. So even though we talk a lot about real estate as being the focus of land banking, our company and our perspective is that we don't want it to be thought of as narrowly only about structures. It's about communities and where does it fit into the broader trajectory of a community that's going through some sort of a redevelopment process. And so it's not just housing, but it's commercial, economic, it's farmland, it's conservation land, it's land and real estate that is being repurposed and recycled for some other use. And much of what we're confronting is the idea that the property had a use at one point in time, and that use has changed, and now we got to do something different. So I wanted to share those thoughts. It's just kind of some grounding thoughts to get us started. I'm now going to turn over the floor to Brent, and I'm going to just pause for a second to get his presentation up on screen, and then I will start looking at some of those chat messages as well, and we'll get going. So, all right, thank you.
Brian, you know if I can advance slides from here, or
I don't see that you have the ability to do that, so I'll do it for you if that's okay.
Yeah, or I can share my screen if it helps.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, then you do have the ability to control it. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen. Okay, so I just had a panel the previous hour where we went through the same presentation. I just want to give a very abbreviated background. I'm happy to discuss any of this in more detail in our discussion today, and then if there are follow-up questions afterward, just contact me and we can continue the discussion. But very broadly, first of all, my name is Brent Denzin. I'm an attorney based out of Chicago, and our firm focuses on community revitalization work with municipalities, counties, development authorities, and land banks. Land banks are our primary clients. We help set them up and operate land banks throughout the state of Illinois, and then work with a network of other practitioners in other states to try to bring in latest strategies to how to intervene and repurpose abandoned properties. And I just want to quickly present some background on what the concept is before some of the executive directors, Emily and Michael, can discuss on the ground, what it is that they do. But a land bank as an entity is a governmental body that is created with one main mission. It's to acquire, manage, and reposition abandoned property. And so it can be commercial property, it can be open space, it can be residential houses. But the idea is that there's an abandoned piece of property, a property that is unmanaged and the owner has walked away, that needs to be controlled in some way and repositioned into a new use. And a land bank has served as that function in Michigan, Ohio, and other states going back to the 1980s. And in Illinois, since 2012, we've been creating intergovernmental land banks. An intergovernmental land bank is a land bank that's populated with municipalities and counties that pool their authority to collectively acquire property, manage it, and dispose of it with existing authority. It's not new authority created or additional government. It's the same governmental authority that exists in municipalities, but just pooled together and shared and executed in a way that provides better outcomes and efficiency. To be clear, municipalities and counties can land bank. They can participate in the operation of land banking without creating a land bank, but a land bank as a separate body helps to bring on new staff and capacity and take on projects that are beyond the capacity of the local level of the local municipalities to take on their own. And so that's why we've seen at this point in time 8 land banks across Illinois start to form to perform this service on behalf of their members. I will strip down. The primary tools that a land bank works with are efforts to go into court to acquire title to a property that's otherwise unavailable to the open market through filing an action that in Illinois is called a declaration of abandonments. In other states, it's condemnation. These are actions that are taken to declare property abandoned and under state law transferred to the municipality and onto the land bank. The other side of this, which is really important in Illinois, is it's integral to work. It's vital to work with the tax system in your county to take the properties that are naturally flowing into the county coffers and repurpose them in a way that is assuring better outcomes. That's something Michigan does very well, and Emily could talk to their system. Illinois does not do very well. So our land banks, like other land banks, are set up to work with those two sources of properties primarily. In addition, we can also have donations, and people that want to try to aggregate property for a larger development can work with land banks to partner on some of those developments, and it can serve as that function where it holds land for some greater purpose. The final thing I'll just touch on is that land banks can use tools to assure better outcomes. It can use deed restrictions and other tools to make sure that properties that come through the system that already exists, such as the tax trustee system in Illinois, land banks can use those tools to convey property with more targeted impacts on the community, to provide benefits that it doesn't necessarily, that currently it's hoping will be provided by the buyers, but using some of these land bank tools, it can assure that a new buyer will rehab a property or will use it for an intended purpose, et cetera. So it provides a more targeted approach to repurposing these properties to provide some stability going on into the future. Brian, do you want me to cover anything beyond this as some background? I'm happy to go into more, but I don't want to step on others' toes.
No, let's go ahead and shift it over to Mike and then Emily, and we can pick up other questions. There's a couple of great questions in chat. So just as a reminder, everybody, we're using the chat to post your questions. No question is a bad question. Just go ahead and stick them in there, and then we'll circle back. I've got 2 questions so far, and we'll come back around and see what else we have. Mike, are you able to share your screen to be the presenter at this point?
I just got kicked off, Brian. Do you mind advancing the slides for me?
No, let me put them up on screen. And folks, let's see, can you see my screen?
We can.
All right. Let me see if I can make this larger. Mike, go ahead and get started, and I will.
All right. So my name is Mike Davis. I'm the executive director of the Central Illinois Land Bank Authority, and I started this job a little over 2 years ago. That's when I moved to Illinois. Prior to this, I worked for LISC in Boston. LISC is a national CDFI. I did all their statewide lending for community development in Massachusetts for a few years, and I also led our energy efficiency and clean energy work. Before that, I worked for New York City's housing agency doing affordable housing projects in the South Bronx, and I oversaw a team of the workflow of 80 architects and engineers. So Central Illinois is a different market than one that I had been working in the last 20 years in community development, and I saw it as a really exciting challenge. Our land bank covers 3 counties. Vermilion County is a member, Champaign County is a member, and Decatur is also a member in Macon County. Their county is not. We were seeded with IDA Land Bank Capacity Program grants. And I'd say, just reflecting, some of our biggest, I think, wins were really, and I've talked to Brian about what does the secret sauce for land banks look like, or keys for success. And I think one of the key things is having tools in place that allow people to take action. And so I'll talk more about this later, but I think one of the key wins that we had was setting a number of our rural communities up for success in adopting a property maintenance code and having a shared code enforcement officer. And to that end, then we worked to line up some grant funding to be able to do implementation in those communities. On a separate note, we just worked last month with the city of Decatur to have a $500,000 ARPA agreement. Decatur has about 5,000 vacant housing units in the city. So our goal is to find abandoned homes, save them, sell them to first-time home buyers. And then we've also worked on larger projects. I came in at the tail end, but the land bank was a conduit to hold 50 plus pieces of abandoned and vacant property for a $70 million hospital consolidation in Danville. So I think we could work on housing, economic development, large projects, a number of things. But I think one of the main things I really want to focus on today is code and the real issue of having a proactive versus a reactive approach. And Brian said this earlier, but I'm a big believer in having a reality-based approach. And I would tell people all the time, my board members, of we can't keep doing the same things over and over again, expecting different results. And so when I went in, and this building's an example, I asked my board member in this community, is this property condemned? Or are you guys going to condemn it? And over again, I heard, Mike, our code doesn't have any teeth. Our code's outdated. There's no one really enforcing the code. Can you help us out here? And my approach was, hey, these are all solvable problems here. So Brian, you want to go to the next slide? So beyond code, the one thing I do want to talk about for rural communities, some of the challenges, you look at planning, even our larger communities, the master plans might be 20 years or older and kind of outdated. So if we're being honest, we don't have great housing or economic development plans. We don't have good data or a systematic data collection system to really track blight. In terms of looking at scaling our work, there aren't a lot of mission motivated developers to partner with. And I'm finding ourselves kind of being the convener, and I'm a big believer in comprehensive community development. And I think, look, I'm one person covering 20 communities. I'm not going to solve everyone's problems. I'm a big believer in partnering. And so I think it's really key to have banks, hospitals, anchor employers, foundations at the table as well, talking about how we work on this. In big picture, I mean, our focus right now is housing, since we're getting mostly IDA grant funds, but I see a big opportunity to leverage money from DCO for economic development, to work on parks and green infrastructure with IDNR funds, and ideally do more brownfields work as well. So for this year, we focused a lot on blight reduction, code education, and I think one of the key things that we did was just the communities that expressed an interest in improving code. Brent has been an awesome resource, and Brent just kind of gave me some boilerplate materials for people to adopt International Property Maintenance Code. And from there, I found a great code enforcement guy in one of our smaller communities. And the mayor said, hey, Mike, you really got to talk to this guy. He might be able to help you out in other communities too. And that was a really wonderful find. And in that community, Seidel, I think it has about 800 residents. And so the mayor was really happy with the code enforcement in this village of less than 1,000 people. And I worked with the code enforcement guy. I think we're up to 10 villages that have hired him now too. And so I think part of this is putting the pieces in place to have an ability to act. And I'm really excited about that. I think on the planning side, IDA has a community revitalization planning team. TESCA has resources. They just completed a housing market and real estate feasibility analysis for Vermilion County and Decatur. And I saw in the chat, one of the questions was around data and how do we get more data? I think TESCA is a great resource. They showed that in Vermilion County, in Danville, 47% of renters have extreme rent burden. In Decatur, that's 42%. And they highlighted that Decatur has 5,000 vacant housing units. So I'm a big believer in having a data-driven approach. And so I think there are a lot of great resources out there. It just took me a little time to wrap my arms around what are they and how quickly could I get some help. We're also looking at potentially building out a nonprofit arm to absorb federal money that's being left on the table in some communities. In general, again, I'll state, I'm a big believer in partnering. I'm not interested in competing with local or neighborhood organizations that want to work together. And you'll see this lemons and lemonades piece. I think we need to start looking more at the health dynamic here. And if any of you are familiar with Robert Wood Johnson's county health rankings, so two of my member communities like Vermilion County, they rank 99 out of 102, and Macon County ranks 89 out of 102. I would like to see more health institutions at the table working with us. And I'll provide a very concrete example. Vermilion County, Champaign County each have 3,500 plus units of rentals that were built pre-1940. HUD has lead abatement grants $1 to $3 million a year. Vermilion County and Champaign County have never applied for that money. So I would like to be the entity that brings people together and says, why are we leaving millions of dollars of federal money on the table for lead abatement that's badly needed in our communities? So you can go to the next slide, Brian. So to look at a smaller community though, Hoopston is an example. It's located in Vermilion County, about 5,000 residents. The one thing that we looked at was, and I needed help with Brent on figuring this out, was how do you obtain title to properties that the member community really cares about? And so I'd get a list of 5, 10, 20 target properties that people wanted to work on. But what I really worked on with Brent is kind of mapping out a decision tree on here are the different options for people to obtain title and take action. And so one of these was looking at our abandonment statute and figuring out how many properties have 2 consecutive years of back taxes and the water shut off. And then we could file to get title in court and either demolish or rehab the property. But Hoopston's a really interesting example. I mean, I don't expect people to kind of zoom in on the individual lot level, but I mean, if you see the reds are all properties that will go to the county trustee in year 3 and be sold for $800 and above. Basically, any properties on this list that the member community cares about, I'm pulling them off the list at $800 and including them in our grant applications and pipeline to take care of them. So anything in red, we're taking action over. And anything in the orange, we're working on, should we pursue these in court and try to get title? I think where this gets interesting though, is you can see a number of these, there's just a blue little outline. And so for some of these properties, the taxes are as low, I've seen as like 10, $50 a year. And so some of these owners, they'll just pay the taxes every single year and let these properties rot and fall in on themselves. And so this is where code enforcement's really important. I mean, some of these properties I'll be able to pull off the list, buy for $800. Some we can work and go to court to take title. But without good code enforcement, all those in blue, you might never be able to take action. You really need good coordinated code enforcement. So next slide, Brian. This is an example too. I mean, when we get into houses, people would say, Mike, you know, once you demolish a house, it's forever gone. It's lost on the tax rolls. Might be hard to build another one. I'm in full agreement. I mean, if we can save homes, we absolutely will. But there are a number that we've come across where it's like asbestos, plenty of black mold, knob and tube wiring. I mean, this is an example of a property that it's an $80,000, $90,000 rehab. And I talked to the realtor, a house in this neighborhood wouldn't go for more than $30,000. So if people want to see a house like this rehabbed up to code, then there needs to be significant subsidy dollars on the table for us to be able to rehab those homes. You can go to the next slide, Brian. And here's an example if we kind of want to end on a feel-good positive note. Catlin is one of our member communities, again, 1,000 people or less. They flagged this property as one of concern. It was basically abandoned. And over a year ago, we started putting things together. We pursued abandonment in court. we found, I put it up for sale recently, a neighbor who lives right in the neighborhood. She's willing to buy this for 5,000 and invest 70,000 or more in the property to bring it up to code. She has 4 brothers that have flipped houses and are gonna help her. So she has a family friend that's a contractor. But to me, this is a big success story. This is a property that could have been left to rot for years on end with neighbors complaining about raccoons and whatever else going in and out of the property. Now we're not making money off this, and I'm going to be clear, but I think it's a great story if we could make our costs on legal fees, and a next door neighbor has a new home next to her family and she's willing to invest 70 grand in this property and it will stay on the tax rolls. I think that's a great win for the community. So the one thing that I'm doing to make things a little bit easier for our members and map things out is I'm basically providing them with a menu of options and saying, look, you can check one thing or 8 things. But, and I think this is important. Some people want a lot out of a land bank. Some communities just want 1 or 2 things. And so we could do light touch stuff like, how do we help you out getting good code in place? But we could kind of move down the line here. Are you interested in demos, homeowner occupied rehabs, vacant land sales, brownfield grants? I think there are a lot of resources out there. The key is kind of figuring out who wants to do what and how do we help put the resources in play to make this happen. And I've been blessed to have great interns from the University of Illinois, their planning department. Like I said, I'm the only full-time employee. So I'm basically relying on 2 to 4 interns at a time to help me advance the work. And I'll be honest, the interns have been helping me write the grant applications to IDA. I have one intern that's helped me bring in over $500,000 in grant funding, and she probably deserves a very big raise. But I mean, my big goal here is let's build the project pipelines, gather the local data so we can make a compelling argument, and just put ourselves in a position to succeed so we quit leaving state and federal resources on the table. So I'd be happy to talk to anyone more. I'm all for let's avoid reinventing the wheel. I'll share any resources that we've created. I'll allow Brent to answer the question on a land bank doing an old mall, because I think there's a different one in the South Suburban Land Bank has done that. But to answer the question that just came in,
Mike, can you hold it? Can you hold the question? Because we're
sure.
Yeah, because Emily's going to present and we can come back around.
I'm done. Go ahead, Brian.
I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just wanted to make sure we save some time because this is a lot. Okay, awesome. I'm going to turn over now to Emily from the state of Michigan, and the state of Michigan has a land bank that's a little bit different than what we've been hearing about. So I'm looking forward to that. Give me 1 second while I, Emily, put your presentation up on screen. Where is your present?
No problem. And actually, Michael, I know you were about to answer the question about the Catlin house. So I was going to say, if you didn't, I was going to say, Michael, you should just answer that question now.
Yeah, Michael, why don't you go ahead and do it while I'm monkeying around with the presentation. I'll try to find this thing and then you guys can keep. So go ahead, Mike.
So going back to how Brent's a very good resource, I'm basically just putting together a purchase and sale agreement where there's a laundry list of all of the things that the prospective buyer is going to be required to do to bring the property up to code. And that'll be listed as an exhibit in the purchase and sale agreement. And so we are kind of putting in great detail here are the expectations. And the expectation is this is done in 1 year or less. Because I told her, I said, the community doesn't want this to be a 5-year-long project where you're doing a handful of things a year. So I'll leave it at that.
Hey, Michael, are you doing that with a deed restriction?
It's a different discussion, but
Okay.
I'm not doing it with the deed restriction because
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we use in Michigan.
All
We use a lot of deed restrictions. So, and but I'll start. Hi, everybody. My name's Emily Doerr, and I'm a little under the weather, so I apologize for sounding a bit like a frog today. But this tea will continue to help me. to have a voice. So again, Emily Doerr, I'm the executive director of the Michigan Land Bank Authority. We do cover the whole state of Michigan, and we were created in 2003 by the Land Bank Fast Track Act, Act 258. And it's riveting. If you want to look it up and read it, it's riveting. We'll put you right to sleep. But since then, we have had, oh boy, 46 county land banks get created through intergovernmental agreements with the state. And so that means that the rest of those counties are what we cover. And the graphic you can see in front of you shows our current inventory. Our inventory in 2003 was much bigger because we had all of the inventory from around the state. And what does that mean? It's properties that have gone through tax foreclosure, then moved to the treasurer, county treasurer, and moved through the auction process, and they don't get bought. And in Michigan, that was hundreds of thousands, I have to say, that's happened just due to the recession. But even before the recession, this obviously 2003, there was a lot of disinvestment in the 90s with a lot of the automotive decline. And so that was the impetus. And then as county land banks form, we transfer our inventory to those counties. So that's in kind of pretty simple. We do keep some of the really nasty properties, the Superfund sites, but in a nutshell. So this is the map. It says 45, but we are back down to 44 counties because one of these counties did dissolve theirs because they don't have any more inventory, and they decided that they didn't need to maintain a land bank. So because now we are their land bank partner, so it's like if you want the local control and local staff, then you can have your local county land bank. But if you don't, then we actually cover the whole state of Michigan and can step in as a partner, can have ownership, can bring our tools. So, and I will say the foreclosing governmental unit thing, that is important. There are 7 counties, 8 counties. I thought 7 because I think we've got one that's trying to become its own FGU. They don't do their own foreclosing at all. And so it doesn't actually go to the county treasurer through auction. Those come directly to us. So just as a matter of clarification. So we also have a Michigan Association of Land Banks, and that is ran, well, I'll say a lot of our land bank boards are chaired by county treasurers. And so those county treasurers either are the main people that run this Association of Land Banks, or if they have paid staff, which of the 44 county land banks, maybe 10 of them have paid staff that are separate for the land bank. The rest of them are all staffed out of the county treasurer's office. Okay, next slide. So this is probably the most important slide for all of you because there's a lot of different things you can do with the parcels that come to us. The home or yard expansion, we do a lot of side lot sales to homeowners. The recreational property, we hold parcels for trails or other recreation. We can actually keep it in perpetuity for the sake of conservation. That's a big thing, and I know that might be of interest to some of you. So conservation, whether it's a land conservation around wetlands or around just other conservation trusts, there's a lot of different models. Renewable energy, we actually have a lot of partnerships happening that are focused on assembling parcels and then using our tools to get the infrastructure ready for solar with our utility companies as partners. Neighborhood gardens, that's a very popular one. We kind of have certain requirements because that one, we found that we only do that with nonprofits, and the nonprofits actually do a better job of maintaining the neighborhood gardens versus just doing it for a random neighborhood group that doesn't have an actual nonprofit entity, because we want to make sure that these uses are not temporary. And if they are temporary, we set them up as interim uses. And there's a whole wonderful resource guide from the Center for Community Progress on interim uses for vacant properties. But we try to sell the land for permanent use to get it back on the tax rolls. Redevelopment, business growth. So I'm happy to answer questions about any of these, some good models. We also have got some interesting stories of specific land banks that I can provide if any of you are interested. So next, just an example project. So jails are a thing in Michigan that we built a lot of them, and now they sit there, these monoliths of blight, and they get occasionally when they are I would like all the jails that are closed to get moved into our inventory. That hasn't happened yet, but the ones that do get moved to our inventory are because they actually are willing to have those sites get redeveloped. So what does that mean? That means normally it means a certain amount of demolition, environmental remediation for the soil, whether it was because it was a farm with pesticides or underground tunnels or whatnot. So lots of that work. So we received this 120 acre parcel and have put about $2.5 million into it for demolition and remediation, and now are actually prepared for the developer who's going to make it into a commercial park. And we've helped, it's right on the border of 2 townships. So we've actually created a new brownfield authority that has representation from both townships. And it's taken a few years, but we've been the convening entity to do that, which again, like Michael said, land banks can be very good conveners when there's multiple levels of government that need to work together. Next slide. This is my last one. So by the numbers, yeah, we've actually demolished quite a bit. A lot of hardest hit funds came through land banks in Michigan. And so quite a few of them went to county land banks, but then for the counties that received hardest hit allocations but didn't have county land banks, we were the recipient. And so, yeah, so just some numbers for you. Obviously, we've been doing this now for 18, did I do that math right? 18 years. I'm just in this role for about the last year and a half, but yeah. Sorry, my dog is loud. Brian, you're muted.
Yep. So Emily, thank you for that. And we have about 15 minutes left. So I've got, I've noted, I think 7 questions. I'm gonna do one more plug and ask folks to identify kind of where you're from and any questions you might have. Any of the questions that we don't get to, we can follow up, but we won't be able to follow up if we don't see your questions. So the first question I wanted to present, and I think anybody could answer this. Maybe I'd ask this to either Brent or Emily, because I think you probably have a little bit more experience in this one than in Central Illinois. But the question has to do with what is the difference between a community land trust and a community land bank? And do these entities, are they in competition with each other? Can they be done collaboratively? Kind of how do those two come together? And I know this is a complex topic, and I'm going to just ask you to kind of touch on it shortly or briefly. Either one who wants to take it.
Yeah, I'm happy to I'll very briefly, because I get asked this question on a daily basis. So land banking is more around holding land to prepare it for putting it back onto the tax rolls. Community land trusts are an affordability model that you would use to, when you invest public dollars into a housing project, you set up a community land trust to then make sure that those public dollars keep the housing project affordable in perpetuity, instead of just having the first round of home buyers benefit from the public subsidy. It allows for that public subsidy to kind of get carried from buyer to buyer to buyer as the home changes hands. Whereas the community land bank so you kind of actually, what I would say, community land banks and community land trusts work together really well for affordable housing. That's my sentence. There we go.
There you go. There you go. So I also will just mention for those that are interested, there is a a national conference coming up in Chicago in September. That's, I think Emily has mentioned Center for Community Progress. We all have worked with Center for Community Progress, who's kind of the national clearinghouse of industry knowledge and practice around land revitalization. This topic will be on the agenda extensively. All of these topics will be on the agenda extensively at that conference in Chicago. So if this topic is of any of these topics kind of pique your curiosity, I suggest marking your calendars for September 7th through the 9th. It is going to be live and it's going to really dig in deep on these topics. Another question we had is the question about data. So Brent, I'm going to maybe put this one to you, which is, as we're thinking about land banking in the state, how important is it for us to be able to collect that data about the number of tax delinquent properties that are being held by county trustees? And are there grants or resources that could be used from a planning grant that one of the entities on the call who is involved in rural capacity building could apply for a grant and then apply that to gather that data and somehow create some kind of report? How would that project kind of move the needle on land banking?
Yeah, so data collection is vital for land banking. I think it not only helps you determine whether a land bank is the right approach for your community, but it also then guides the land bank's actions. As Michael was saying, that's day to day. You look at that chart that he had, or the map, sorry, and that helps to guide exactly where you're going to spend your time that day and what strategy you use. And so I think data is extremely important. Right now in Illinois, the Illinois Housing Development Authority, IDA, is the main agency that's dealing with funds that are going to land banks. So there are other agencies that have grants that dance around land banking, but the one that is I think most on point is a grant from IDA, from the Land Bank Capacity Program, to have an initial assessment done to determine whether it makes sense to have a land bank and what the land bank would do if you created one. So essentially it funds a feasibility study. It can offshoot into a housing study and other related studies that help to present a picture of what your community looks like with regard to abandoned structures, and then specifically helps to provide, I think, the foundation for future data collection. So it doesn't give you every data point you need, but you add on top of these layers of utility use and abandoned, and then now you start to see a picture of where your land bank would spend time.
So just to follow up on that, so what we're talking about, I think, is maybe two different concepts. One is the kind of a sort of a community-based needs assessment driven by data that's, I think, very similar to what Mike did in Silva working with Tesca, which is to kind of assess conditions on the ground and kind of overlay different types of data. And then maybe there's a second opportunity or related opportunity, which is to look statewide at how are the tax trustee properties specifically, which are being held typically by the tax trustee for the county, what does that inventory of property look like? And because I don't know if IDA would fund, for example, a study that was done on the property tax system. That's more of a advocacy type of a project or an academic type of a project. But I think that data would also help to inform statewide what is the universe of properties that we currently have being held by tax trustees. And then I think that gives you the opportunity to stitch together different counties where you have concentrations or different types of properties. I think the difficulty right now for many of us is we simply don't know. We have lists of property records that are parcel identification numbers on a spreadsheet. It's very hard to discern what is that parcel. Is it underwater? Is it an easement? Is it leftover from a railroad project? I mean, we need to really get into the details of it. And I think that's a segue to ask Mike about something that you showed on your slide, which was that Hoopeston slide. How many properties in Hoopeston were represented, roughly speaking, on that slide that you showed us? The ones that were, colored of different variations of color.
Yeah, there are several dozen. And basically, and I think, Brian, this is a great success story where IDA was coming out with grants and for strong communities. And I told several of our members, hey, if any of you are interested in really just doing this just for the one community to see if we could get you a bunch of money. And what we did was we identified 20 to 30 projects they were interested in working on. We went not just to IDA for funding, but Hoopeston has a small foundation. And the foundation said, hey, if you can get state money, we'll match it up to 100,000. But they said, we want to see the city put in money too. And so for a community of 5,000 people, we got $125,000 state grant, $100,000 foundation grant, and the city put in 50. So I have over $250,000 to do blight related work in Hoopeston. And the mayor's a great guy. They're action oriented, but that's just for housing, Brian. I think one of the next things that we want to work on is their downtown has a number of buildings that are basically falling in on themselves. They have squatters. There's a real need to address the commercial properties. And there's just like the residential on code, there's sort of this fear of taking action. And for one building owner, it was like, well, I said, what's the plan? And they said, we're going to take him to court. And I said, you're going to take the guy to court that doesn't have any resources to address the building? And so this sort of comes back to the planning and what is the plan and the vision for the community. And once we have a plan and a vision, then we can work on implementing it. But you need to have a reality-based strategy to come back to your secret sauce, sort of elements of the secret sauce.
Brian, if I could
just
interject one, before we move off the funding topic, I think a really important area of funding to look at is your county trustee program itself as a source of funding. So the big difference between Emily's last slide, which how the huge amount of impact that they've had on a statewide basis in terms of demolitions and rehabs, is because when Emily refers to a foreclosing unit, that's the unit that takes over the property once it goes into tax foreclosure if it's not bought by a private buyer. So who's the entity that's taking over? In Illinois, that's the county. And so we are running those county trustee programs separately. They're not integrated in a land banking system like Michigan, but we operate them the same. We bring in the properties into a land bank, essentially at the county level, and we sell them off using our agents. There's money that is brought in through that system through redemptions of delinquent taxes and penalties, and the sale of the property itself, of which the money there is allowed by state law to be used to maintain the properties. It can be used for a study to look at what it is that we're trying to do with our auction sales and what are the outcomes when we sell these properties, because a lot of the blight we're talking about, the properties have gone through that system at least once. And so that's a good place to start. And the money that is generated from that system in terms of redemption interest and sales could be used to fund some of these studies on a local level to figure out how should we be steering some of these properties to increase, I guess, to produce a better result, whether it's financially or long-term beneficial outcome.
Yeah, I think there's several things that you both have touched on. You've all touched on that I think are important for us to recognize here. One is the land bank can serve as a catalytic development partner to help identify opportunities and bring in resources. So it's really an opportunity, I think, from what I'm hearing in the case of Silva in particular. You've grown the resource pie by simply doing the work. You've brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars or surfaced hundreds of thousands of dollars that, may have existed in the community in the case of the foundation, but didn't have a particular place to be deployed. Or in the case of state grants, you've actually helped to bring in new money. And so I think there's a sense that we oftentimes encounter where governments are thinking, well, we don't want to create another entity because then who's going to pay for it? Well, in this case, Silva is paying for its own work by going out and finding the money and bringing it in. And we don't want to encourage people to think of land banks as self-sustaining, because that's a whole nother issue. But the idea is it's growing the resource pie. The other thing I want to mention is that the land bank can help direct interest in a way that other parties may not. So in the case of your tax trustee, most tax trustees are set up to sell the property to anybody who comes along. They make their money when the properties get sold. If it gets sold, well, there's other properties they can sell, right? So the land bank is actually saying, no, we want to see those properties get reactivated. Let us get involved and try to help motivate the sale by surfacing properties of opportunity and so forth. The tax trustee doesn't have that interest and probably doesn't have the capacity to do that work, that legwork that's required. So I think there's an opportunity to leverage the tax sale system in that regard. The other thing I wanted to mention or go back to Mike and just touch on, we have about 2 minutes left. And if anybody has any other questions or wants to put a thing in chat, we can talk about it. It's this notion of forming a chodo. I think that there is a real lack of community development capacity in many communities of folks that can actually do the construction or the rehab work. How are you guys tackling that issue in Central Illinois? And Emily, maybe you could talk about the work you've done in the time we have left about how you've helped to bridge that. Oh, we've got 30 seconds. No, we've got 40 seconds. I'll stop talking.
Brian, I'll be brief. I think that we're in the preliminary stages. There's some communities that are essentially leaving federal home dollars on the table. And beyond the federal money, let's be open. Right in Illinois, land banks are created through intergovernmental agreements. So I'm not a 501c3. Some foundations will only give to a nonprofit. And so whether it's absorbing federal funds, absorbing foundation funds, I think there's lots of opportunity. But I think some of this comes back to, like you had mentioned, it's with data, it's just start putting problems on paper, figure out what funding is available and go from there.
Yeah.
But you need to start with putting the problems down on paper.
Thanks. Emily, you want to close us out? You got 30 seconds before Eric shuts the room off.
I would say Mike's right. Identify what the problems are, but then the tools that you need, I would say talk to Brent and Brian, because they're going to be able to tell you what tools you need that would make this work possible. And then I guess the other piece is listen to, you guys are local governments, mostly a lot of regional governments. You know what you need, listen to your residents, but definitely don't let the state, and I, as somebody who works in the state of Michigan, I say this all the time, I'm not here to tell locals what they need. I'm here to help them do what they want in their community. So stick to your guns on what you want. And yes, form chodos to get home funds. That's a good thing. So have a great day, everybody. And
All right.
call Brian if you need any of our
Oh,